Good evening. We want to first thank you for taking the time tonight to be with us for our presentation, What is Ours to Do? The Catholic Call to End the Death Penalty. I'm Deacon Paul Kipstool. I'm the director of the Diocesan Social Action Office for Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Cleveland for Wayne, Ashland, and Medina counties. I'm very pleased that we have been able to partner tonight with Catholic Mobilizing Network and Witness to Innocence to bring this presentation to you. The death penalty is something that the Catholic Church is opposed to, and the recent increase in the federal executions has renewed a call to end the death penalty. Just yesterday, the governor of Virginia signed legislation to end the death penalty in Virginia, and we're hopeful that we can do the same thing here in Ohio. So without any further ado, if we can just go through a couple of quick ground rules before we introduce the speakers here. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function for that. If you have questions for our Q&A session, use the Q&A dialog box to submit those. We're going to ask you to please not use the raise hand feature. And also, just so you know, the webinar will be recorded and we will be sending a link out to everybody who has registered. Now, without any further ado, let me take a couple of moments here to introduce our speakers tonight. We're very pleased to have with us Emma Tackey, who is the Associate Director of Community Engagement for the Catholic Mobilizing Network, and she has been there for the past 3 years. After earning a bachelor's degree in political science and gender studies from the College of St. Benedict in Minnesota, Emma moved to Seattle, Washington for a year of service with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest. Upon completing that time, Emma spent a year with Network Lobby in Washington, D.C., working for social and economic issues as a grassroots mobilization associate. Emma lives in Washington. We're also pleased tonight that Kwame Ajamu is with us. Kwame is a death row exoneree from Ohio who served 28 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. He was exonerated after 39 years and has become focused on abolishing the death penalty all over the world and fighting for criminal justice reform. Kwame now lives in Ohio with his wife and serves as chairman of the board of Witness to Innocence. I know tonight's presentation is going to be very informative, and so we'll turn it over to Emma to get us started.
Thank you so much, Deacon Paul. Good evening, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you in this virtual setting. I have a lot of things to share with you all this evening before we get to hear from Kwame, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. If you are not familiar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, we are the national Catholic organization that works to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice through education, advocacy, and prayer. We recognize that each person is created in the image and likeness of God. All human life is sacred. It is often said that hurt people, but there is joy in knowing that the converse is equally true. Transformed people can and will help transform brokenness. I am here this evening to highlight what the Catholic Church teaches about capital punishment and how restorative justice helps clarify and deepens our understanding when it comes to learning how the Catholic faith calls us to uphold the dignity of all human life and how this helps inform our mission to end the death penalty. Then I'll provide some context around the current status of the death penalty across the country, especially what's been going on with federal executions. And then we'll get in to a little more narrow of a focus and we'll talk about how Ohio fits into the death penalty landscape and what opportunities are before us in Ohio. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So a bit of background about CMN. In 2005, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops launched its Catholic campaign to end the use of the death penalty. In 2008, murder victim family members, women religious, including Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking, US CCB staff, and death penalty abolitionists convened and worked out a plan to help carry out the US CCB's campaign to end the use of the death penalty. In 2009, the result of that convening was Catholic Mobilizing Network, which was established as a sponsored ministry of the Congregation of St. Joseph. Next slide, please. So, based on the gospel value that every human life is created in the image and likeness of God, CMN expresses the fundamental belief that all those who have caused or been impacted by crime should be treated with dignity. For a long time, the official Catholic Church teaching maintained that the death penalty was appropriate only under the very rare circumstances that a death sentence was the only way of safeguarding the common good. However, as standards of decency have evolved throughout time and societies have ensured structures in place to protect society from individuals who have caused great harm, the Church's 3 most recent popes have all made public statements in their time calling for the worldwide abolition of the death penalty. And then on August 2nd, 2018, building on the teaching of Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, Pope Francis and the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith formalized that the death penalty is inadmissible. While understanding of doctrines may develop, the principles that support those doctrines do not change. For example, the underlying principle that we as Catholics are called to uphold and honor the dignity of the human person has not changed. The revised text of the Catholic Catechism crystallized the Church's teaching on the death penalty. Next slide, please. This past fall, you may be familiar, on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, Pope Francis released his 3rd papal encyclical entitled Fratelli Tutti on the topic of fraternity and social friendship. In the encyclical, the Holy Father unequivocally reaffirms the inadmissibility of capital punishment in the eyes of the Catholic Church. Revenge is also mentioned 12 times in this encyclical. Pope Francis warns against being, quote, obsessed with taking revenge and destroying the other, end quote. For CMN, we recognize revenge or vengeance as the underbelly of capital punishment. It is likely what allows individuals, even faithful Catholics, to tolerate the practice of the death penalty. At best, the indifference to revenge is what allows more than 25 states to have the death penalty on the books. Those calling for the death penalty, we often hear that it's for the purpose of bringing closure and justice to victims. However, time and time again, we hear the stories of murder victim family members who declare that taking another person's life in their name not only doesn't bring them any sense of healing, it actually can cause further re-victimization and traumatization. As Vicky Schieber put it, quote, pursuing the death penalty would not be the way we would want to honor our daughter's life, nor would that decision have helped us deal with the painful reminders of her unfulfilled hopes and dreams. Next slide, please. At Catholic Mobilizing Network, as we work to eliminate the death penalty, which we recognize to be the most punitive, violent, and dehumanizing practice in our legal system, we also promote restorative justice and work to uplift responses to harm that are consistent with the gospel, centered on healing people, repairing relationships, and uplifting human dignity of all those impacted, including victims, offenders, and communities. There is no single way to define restorative justice, but at CMN, we tend to describe it this way. Restorative justice is a principled approach to justice that emphasizes living in right relationship and resonates deeply with gospel values and Catholic social teaching. Where human dignity and relationships are violated by harm and injustice, restorative justice upholds human dignity, builds relationship, seeks healing, and enables transformation within individuals, communities, and social systems. Restorative justice practices can include those impacted by harm in voluntary processes, aim to address needs, build understanding, repair harm, and work toward healing together through dialogue. A restorative justice approach undergirds opposition to the death penalty, centers the needs of victim survivors, promotes racial equity, honors Indigenous peacemaking tradition, and actualizes forgiveness and reconciliation. Restorative justice is first and foremost a philosophy. It focuses on repairing the harm and relationships violated by harm and is deeply connected to the biblical concept of shalom, or living in right relationship with God and one another. In this work, we are constantly reminded that our church teaches that this human dignity is not only individual, but relational, and we are integrally connected with one another. When one of our brothers or sisters in Christ suffers, all suffer with us. As we explore the Christian underpinnings of this approach, we acknowledge that the global social movement and practice of restorative justice owes a great debt toward numerous Native American and other Indigenous peacemaking and healing traditions. We humbly honor the many Indigenous teachers who have generously shared their knowledge for the benefit of all peoples. We also recognize that knowledge has often been taken, along with land and other resources, without permission from Indigenous peoples throughout the US and the world. As a Catholic organization, we also recognize the historic role of the Church as an agent of colonization. We are guided by our gospel values and Catholic social teaching to continue to learn, understand, reflect, and act with an aspiration toward right relationships with Indigenous peoples in this country and beyond. Next slide, please. Another way we can think about restorative justice is in terms of the questions that it asks compared to the ones that our traditional criminal legal system asks. Traditional justice asks, what was the crime, who was guilty, and what should their punishment be? In our legal system, crime is defined as a violation against the state, not against people. In contrast, restorative justice asks a different set of questions. Consider, what was the harm, who was impacted, and what needs to be done to make it right? For example, we know that there are countless acts of racism that are not classified as crime, but are deeply harmful nonetheless. Additionally, when an instance of harm takes place, these questions allow us to consider what broader societal or structural issues may have contributed to it and address underlying causes to the extent possible. Next slide, please. So with this understanding of church teaching about the death penalty and how restorative justice principles undergirds our work, let's take a look at the landscape of the death penalty in the United States. The past 12 years have seen tremendous advances in the death penalty abolition movement. 23 states have officially abolished their death penalty. 8 of those states have ended the death penalty in the last 11 years. Virginia, as Deacon Paul mentioned, being the most recent one as of yesterday, when Governor Northam signed Virginia's bill to repeal the death penalty into law. The Commonwealth of Virginia is the 23rd state to abolish the death penalty, but the first Southern state to do so. So this is especially significant because Virginia holds the title for the highest number of executions ever carried out. If Virginia can repeal the death penalty, then of course there is hope that every state who still has the practice can do the same. No matter their history, they can turn over a new chapter. Additionally, in this time frame of 12 years, the governors of 4 states have imposed official moratoriums on executions in their states. One of those states, the most recent one to have a governor-imposed moratorium was California, which was declared in 2018 by Governor Gavin Newsom. This was truly remarkable because California is home to the largest death row on the Western Hemisphere, with over 700 people on its row. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this map, there is a lot of red, but let's note that 2/3 of states in the country have moved away from the practice of capital punishment. So even though 27 states still have the death penalty on the books, really we're only seeing a handful of states continue to carry out executions. For example, many states like Wyoming still has the death penalty, but it hasn't carried out an execution since 1992, and it doesn't have anyone on its death row currently. So we're seeing these trends on a state-by-state level, and they're really a sharp contrast to the recent actions of the federal government. We recognize that the resumption of federal executions, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, were wrong-headed and out of step with how the rest of the country is slowly but surely moving away from the practice of capital punishment. Next slide, please. So of course, we know it doesn't take much digging to discover that there are a myriad of things wrong with the death penalty, and racial injustice is perhaps the most glaring of them all. The intersection of racial injustice and the criminal legal system is never more apparent than when we take a step back and consider the roots of our country's death penalty. So I want to bring our attention to a recent report about race and the death penalty published this fall by the research nonprofit Death Penalty Information Center. Next slide, please. So this report confirms many aspects of the historical roots of capital punishment that we recognize in today's legal system. The modern day death penalty has direct links to slavery, lynching, and the Jim Crow era. race affects every stage of a death penalty case. Prosecutors are more likely to seek death if the victim is white than if the victim is Black. Black citizens are systemically excluded from capital juries. 50% of homicide victims are Black, yet more than 75% of the murder victims in cases resulting in an execution were white. Next slide, please. Moving on to another huge issue in the death penalty system is the factor of innocence and who are we sentencing to death. This past February, again, the Research Center Death Penalty Information Center released a special report analyzing 185 death penalty cases that resulted in exonerations of people wrongfully sentenced to death. The report concludes that the majority of wrongful convictions are not accidental and resulted in the addition of 11 names to the Death Penalty Information Center's innocence list. Evidence now shows that for every 8.3 people executed in the United States since 1973, one wrongfully sentenced person has been exonerated. It does not matter where you are located, wrongful convictions happen at every region of the country in states that practice the death penalty. No state that practices the death penalty is immune from the risk of sentencing an innocent person to death. This disturbingly high rate of wrongful death sentences can be attributed to 8 primary causes, and those would be official misconduct, false confession, false or misleading forensic evidence, inadequate legal defense, insufficient evidence, mistaken witness identification, perjury or false accusation, and DNA evidence. Next slide, please. Additionally, another huge factor concerning the death penalty is the arbitrariness of it all on a geographical level. What many people don't realize is how truly geographically isolated the death penalty is. 2% of counties are responsible for 59% of death row in the country. There's a clear geographic difference in death penalty usage across the country and within individual states. From the time executions resumed in 1977 through April 2020, 82% of all executions in the US have taken place in the South. From January 5th, 2015 through April 2020, just 5 states, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Missouri, carried out 83% of all executions. Even within a state, the death penalty is usually pursued in only a handful of counties, although the expense is often shared by all taxpayers in that state. Next slide, please. So understanding how fundamentally flawed the death penalty is, we can now turn our attention to what we saw happen between the months of July 2020 and January 2021 with federal executions. To be sure, the reasons why the federal death penalty on the federal level are wrong are the same reasons why the death penalty on a state level is wrong. It's riddled with errors and misconducts, which also heightens the risk of executing an innocent person. Executions stem from our country's history of racial violence, with direct links to our past of lynching Black Americans. It is geographically isolated and arbitrary, and truly out of step with the national trend of decreasing rates of executions and death sentences. Next slide, please. Here on this, you can see some other facts and figures of the current status of the death penalty nationwide. In July 2019, the Department of Justice first announced its plan to resume federal executions after nearly 17 years. So, of course, executions were happening on a state level, but there hadn't been an execution by the federal government in the federal death penalty in 17 years. So the Department of Justice scheduled 5 executions over the next several months. However, due to a barrage of legal challenges, all of those executions were delayed. And then flash forward to 1 year later in the summer of 2020, when on June 15th, as we were in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, the Department of Justice announced that in July, 3 men would be scheduled for execution within a 5-day period. A 4th and 5th execution was scheduled for the end of August. Of course, this was all deeply concerning. Next slide, please. Since that June announcement, 12 men and 1 woman were executed under the Donald Trump administration. You can see their names here. All 13 people were killed by lethal injection. Daniel Lewis Lee and Wesley Ira Perky were executed despite their death warrants expiring. Wesley Ira Perky also suffered from schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. Lesmond Mitchell was the first Native American to be executed by the federal government in the modern era of the death penalty. Christopher Villalba was the first African American man executed in the recent slew of federal executions. And Lisa Montgomery was the first woman to be executed by the federal government in a number of years as well, I believe over 50 years. So now, after this spree of federal executions, we are under a new presidential administration, right? We have now President Biden, who is a Catholic. There are no more federal executions scheduled, and we don't anticipate that President Biden will allow any more federal executions to go through. So now we have before us is, an opportunity. On the campaign trail, President Biden denounced the federal death penalty. And now that he's the first sitting president to publicly oppose the death penalty, we want him to take really strong action toward ending the federal death penalty. We'll share a link in the chat later on that goes to a petition CMN has that urges President Biden to take concrete steps toward ending the federal death penalty, but we're not quite there yet. So the conversation, of course, we can go on to the next slide, please. The conversation on whether to abolish the death penalty has stretched on for decades, and of course, there's really strong opinions on both sides, understandably. Historically, seeking the repeal of capital punishment at the federal level has not been politically viable. In fact, since CMN's inception, state repeal campaigns have been much more active and benefited from bipartisan energy toward abolishing the death penalty. So we definitely will continue to monitor action at the federal level, keeping an eye on congressional opportunities and supporting President Biden to take action. But we are definitely keeping up the pressure in states to continue to, state by state abolish the death penalty. Which brings us to, after understanding the general status of the death penalty nationwide, all the issues that are at play, we can now focus in on Ohio. Ohio, as you may know, has a current death row population of about 140 people. The last execution was in 2018, that of Robert Van Hook. 11 people have been exonerated from the state's death row, one of whom is here tonight. 21 people have been granted clemencies. And as you can see, just like in the rest of the country, only a small number of counties are responsible for the majority of death sentences in Ohio. Also, more than half of the individuals on Ohio's death row are people of color, even though they make up a very small fraction, just 16% of Ohio's population. Next slide, please. So Ohio's death penalty reflects the same failings that we're seeing in all the other states that still have the death penalty. And yet, new opportunities are emerging in Ohio that are encouraging signs that the state's death penalty is on its last legs, which is why we're here tonight to talk about, what opportunities are there for us to take action. Some quick, moments of light for Ohio's death penalty, present and future moving forward. Currently, there's no way for Ohio to carry out executions. The state was using lethal injection as its method of execution, but in 2019, a federal judge's ruling said that Ohio's current execution protocol caused the inmate, quote, severe pain and needless suffering, meaning if the state wants to carry out any executions, lawmakers must first choose a different method of executing people. And that doesn't seem likely to happen, as Governor DeWine has shared publicly himself that he doesn't see support in the legislature for making a switch in execution method as a priority. He even went so far as to say that Ohio has an unofficial moratorium on capital punishment. The governor has also made headlines during his 2-year term by commuting the death sentences of more than a dozen people on Ohio's death row. And you may have heard in January, Governor DeWine signed into law a bill that prohibits people with severe mental illness from receiving a death sentence. The bill's passage is the result of a multi-year effort in the state's legislature to limit Ohio's death penalty, and Ohio is actually the first state to put such an exemption into law, which is thrilling for Ohio, and then it shows us that there's work to be done in other states too. Public support for Ohio's death penalty is also waning. A recent poll showed that 59% of Ohioans are in favor of replacing the death penalty with a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And finally, legislation to fully abolish Ohio's death penalty has been introduced in the current session. 2 abolition bills, one from the House and one from the Senate. We will have an action specifically around these bills that we'll share with you later on during the webinar for you to take action on. But for now, I know I just gave you a ton of information, but I'm going to pause here and pass it off now to Kwame Ajamu, who's going to share his experience with how the death penalty has impacted life. Kwame, my friend, I will pass it off to you now.
Right. Everybody got me, I'm sure. Thank you so much for having me tonight. This is indeed an honor for me to be here. It's always a pleasure, and I feel my duty to represent not only witness to innocence, but the great power and the authority that we have towards abolition in capital punishment in Ohio and also the world over. As a child, 17 years old, my story began. I was, I like to say, accosted by Cleveland Police Department, along with my brother who was 20 and my good friend Ricky Jackson, who was 18, charged with aggravated murder and sentenced to die. I was sentenced to die before my 18th birthday. When I arrived at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility at Lucasville, which is where the death house was at that time, in 1976. There was a great many atrocities going on within the death house itself, with the men first and foremost suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, PTSD, and the like. And then there was also the neglect and abuse from the prison authorities on said individuals on death row. My third day there, well, let me back up. My first day there, I was introduced to the death chair itself. And can you imagine just getting ready to turn 18 in October and showing me the death chair and telling me that this is one day would be the hot date that I would go and sit in and she would fry my brains. You know, the third day that I was there, I woke up to a gentleman screaming in an intensified scream that he would bail for at least 6 hours that day. And it was all because the men would play chess by number. And one of the guys had made a move to 47 on his chessboard, which happened to correspond with the old gentleman's cell. And in his paranoid state, he thought that the execution time was upon him. And he just began to scream, "Oh Lord, no, oh Lord, no, oh Lord, no," for hours upon hours. This is my third day there. And, you know, I was, man, I was just flabbergasted. I didn't know what was going on. You know, and the guys on the cell block where I was at death row, they were continuing on playing chess and, you know, reading and hollering back and forth to each other as if, you know, it was just a regular day, you know. This was day 3 for me, and I was like, dear God, you know, what have I gotten myself into, you know? And this was based upon innocence, pure innocence. May 19th, 1975, the day that it all happened, a Caucasian money order salesman entered my neighborhood, which was there at Cedar 105 in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, on what would be the last day of his life. He stopped at Fairmount Cut Rate store and to either deliver or pick up money orders or monies. And upon leaving, he was robbed and killed. Subsequently, myself, my brother, and my friend would be charged with this murder and sentenced to die. This happened in the neighborhood. We were a very close-knit neighborhood. The woman store proprietor's wife, Mrs. Robinson, was also shot in the neck that day because she looked out the store to observe what was going on with Mr. Franks was the dead man's name. And she was shot in the neck for looking out the door. And she would testify in court that no, she didn't see either myself or a brother or a friend, and that she didn't recognize the person who shot her. How we were identified or accused in this particular case was very, very harsh indeed. Falls upon the coercion and false witness identification, which is strongly spoken about throughout the movement of abolition. But there was a young boy, 12 years old, 5 years younger than me. I was 17. So you can imagine he was really a baby. But he was a neighborhood kid, also a paper boy. I went to school with two of his sisters. You know, we was close like that. And when the cops asked if anybody'd seen it or knew what was going on, he would be the one to say, you know, I did. And so they took him in and began to interrogate him. And it would come down to him calling to speak with his mother. And his mother, this kid was known for being very, how can you say, he had a very vivid imagination. You know, he would stretch the truth a lot. And so his mother told him that if he was on one of his expeditions, you know, he should end it and come on home, tell the truth. But we didn't know at that time, of course, the authorities did, and the boy did, that the reason why his mother wasn't there in the first place is because she was in the hospital there. Then we called it Lakeside, but now it's University Hospitals. She was there suffering from ovarian cancer, which would subsequently take her life. But the cops told this kid that if he didn't come up out of this interrogation room and point out, I wasn't there, I was in juvenile, but my brother and Ricky, who was there in the county jail, as being, you know, the murder proprietors, he would go and arrest his mother and charge her with this crime of what do you call perjury? We charge her with perjury. And so, you know, the kid bit, which I believe I would have, you know, not knowing the difference, you know, not having a scale of knowledge, just a whole lot of things that a little 12-year-old boy didn't have with him, especially a guardian or a parent, you know. So he came out of the phone room back into the interrogation room, and he started picking out, you know, the guys. And I would subsequently be picked out the next week as being part and parcel of this crime. I would serve 28 years in prison, 3 of which was on death row, which was possibly the worst time in my life. So many of my elder parents passed away during that time. All of my mother's aunts and uncles, my grandparents, my great aunts, 6 aunties, 3 uncles, my grandfather. I had a nephew that died, and a cousin. Whilst I was on death row. I would come out of death row and do 25 years into what they call general population, Southern Ohio Correctional Facilities, where I learned a few skills, a few trades. Cutting hair was what I was doing then, was barbering. But I would then be transferred out of there to Lima Correctional Institution, is where I actually got a break for myself and going forward towards the abolitionist movement, which consequently, I became an abolitionist in my heart on death row. That was the moment where, you know, as a child, I began to question everything: God, my existence, the devil, why, how come people were born blind? This lady who I knew couldn't hear. Just the whole spectrum of being ignorant and not having a proper support system that was needed at that particular time, which again is why I like to go into the communities and discuss these things and bring forth a better understanding, because there was none in 1975 for me and my family in that community. And so I would get into, at Lima, into education. There was no school there because Lyman was an institution that at one time was a territorial mental health institution. They turned it into a prison. And so once we got there, they needed school and everything. We begged and we did everything. And finally, we got a school. And I became the administrative clerk in that school, and for 20 odd years as such. And I would help thousands of men graduate from high school, develop themselves and their academic skills, and go on into bachelor's degrees, associate degrees, and all of the vocational academia that they could aspire to want. And thus it landed me a chance to go again to Mansfield, which they opened a new institution in 1998 called Ricky, and it was based on educational theme. There again, as the educational clerk and the clerk for pre-release, I teamed up with 4 other men, and we put the NAACP branch there in that institution in Richland Correctional Institution. And so in 2003, I guess they were tired of me doing good things for the community, and they gave me a parole. And so I actually went through the system tooth and nail and made a parole as being convicted wrongfully. And then I got on this hard quest of finding a solution to my problem, of freeing my brother and my brothers, Ricky and Buddy, widely raised when I call him Buddy, and exonerating our names. And so it would take me 11 years to do so, from 2003 when I was paroled. In 2004, I was married to a very lovely woman who stood with me all the way until today, as my ride or die, my right hand, my everything. And together we found a lawyer first, and then a person who would investigate our situation by the name of Kyle Swinson, who was a young kid that did freelance writing for the Cleveland Scene magazine. And at first, I didn't believe in the kid at first. He was so young, he was 24. But as good deeds come to those who wait, this young man went and took my story, and he brought it to the forefront of the entire world. And here we are today with me telling you that I love him as if he was my own brother. I love him so much because he actually saved me from a horrible past and a horrible future. And he gave me one, and he gave me a chance to give back. And that's what I'm doing today. I was exonerated in 2014. It was a long, hard quest. This kid, Kyle, he wrote stories. First, What the Boys Seen. And it did good, but only in the political world. The rest of the world saw it as, oh, it's just a sad story. And so we came back and tried again. But before we tried again, we put a little bit more pressure on this one kid who we remembered, from the past, who had said, I seen it. And sure enough, he was in torment himself with his own self. And he had told his pastor that he had caused the lives of 3 men to be ruined as children. And he had a nervous breakdown, and he went into the hospital, and on and on and on and on. Finally, Kyle caught up with his preacher somehow, and they talked, and then lawyers were involved. And this kid, now 53 years old, recanted his story. And this recantation was so powerful that the team of lawyers that came in from Cuyahoga County, the entire team of prosecutorial lawyers could not get this guy to budge, And he said, I'm no longer a child, you can't scare me, this is what happened, this is what these cops did, and this is how I made it happen. And we became free. My mom was gone, my older sister, my older brother, all my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, they were all gone. There was no one for me to say glory, glory. Only had my wife, and she hugged me so tight because she believed in me. and Kyle Swinson, who took my story, I get emotional, who took my story and brought it to the forefront, and then came Witness to Innocence, who I believe is a leader in death penalty abolition, because we have human testimonies, people like myself, who was once a child and now considered a senior in the community. Time lost and wasted for no good reason other than because I was in that red line zone. The hue of my skin, the fact that I was uneducated. There was no money in our family to pay for a lawyer. The fact that there was already predetermined conditions for me to be arrested and sentenced to die. It's a miracle that I didn't die. It is beyond fathomable reasons that I did not die. That of all the men and women that were sentenced, that today there are 185 of us who didn't die. The light of truth is stronger than anything. Sometimes it takes years, decades, eons, millennium. There's a young man named George Stanley who was executed wrongly at the age of 14, 70 plus years ago, and he was just exonerated. Sometimes it takes a human miracle for our realities to come true. But I'm here to tell you today that capital punishment is no deterrent. There's nothing good about it. There's no end to the pain and suffering that it causes human beings like myself, and what it does to families that I no longer have, and how it affects a community who longs to be educated so that their young ones doesn't fall into this type of harm's way. I chair now an organization that is built on the sole purpose of eradicating capital punishment as we see it. That means everywhere that capital punishment exists. I live with a group of guys and girls now who hate in their heart, who do with their hands, who dispel what their eyes see in the form of capital punishment, mass incarceration, wrongful incarceration. I chair an organization of men and 2 women who, just like me, were once sentenced to die, but were not executed, and are thus survivors of death row. And yet we champion the course of its existence from here on out. There can be no greater example than myself and my friends at Witness to Innocence. I'm so proud to be here today to represent this great organization and to tell you that as long as I live, I will stand against capital punishment. Thank you for hearing me. And I'm sure we'll get together again on the question and answer.
Kwame, thank you so much. There are no words to encapsulate the gratitude that I know I'm feeling, and I'm sure many others are feeling, to have you here with us tonight, and that the miracle it is that you are here. We're going to spend the next few minutes together in contemplative silence. And I want us to reflect on what may be stirring in our own hearts and in our minds as we think about what Kwame shared, the facts and figures of the death penalty, and how we are called to work against this system of capital punishment. And after a few minutes of silence, we'll move on to our question and answer portion of the evening. And then we'll give you some concrete action steps before we wrap up.
Again, just a reminder, if you have questions, to please go ahead and type them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There is one right now. Kwame, if you could give us a little bit of information about Witness to Innocence and the role that you are playing in educating police, prosecutors, and the public about wrongful convictions.
Sure. So one of the things that, and this is a good segue to that, that Witness to Innocence is, it's like our baby, is an advocacy and justice program that we have set up as a workshop, which we actually dialogue with prosecutors. And we are invited to do such. We have went, oh man, California, New York, Chicago, Washington, Baltimore, Maryland, everywhere, you name it. We have been in dialogue with prosecutors. And what this does is brings two things. First and foremost, you've never heard of the two sides intermingling. Prosecutors and the defense sides never come together and talk. Secondly, but more important, it kind of opens their eyes more to look out for things that go wrong from the ground up, which enables the misconduct from police officers and as well as prosecutorial misconduct. The entire spectrum is now looked at a broader, with a broader conception, simply because they had never ever heard how we perceive or what we think or what we defend against on their side. And so once they put all this information together and we go back and forth and they ask the different questions and get the answers, and then they grade us and everything, it's great, you know, but they come away with a better, I'd say a good 30 to 60% better perspective than they had. And going forward, and they know how to police a little better. And yeah, it's working too. New York loves us. Brooklyn, oh my God, they love us. Yeah.
And Emma, I have one here for you. What advice would you give to people whose pastors still teach that the admissibility of the death penalty is arguable, or that there are exceptions when it's appropriate? And do you know what kind of guidance clergy have received from the various dioceses regarding the 2018 revision to the Catechism?
That is a great question. It's a sticky question. Gosh, I think responding to pastors who still think the church's position around the death penalty is murky the Catechism is very clear at this point, and our past three popes have all publicly advocated for an end to the death penalty. So maybe one way to go about this is the pastors could look to Catholic Mobilizing Network's resources. We have a ton. Or another way to do it would be maybe you could approach the person who wants to speak to their pastor about, changing their heart and mind around the death penalty. That person could reach out to another pastor and have the pastor speak to the pastor in question, kind of a peer-to-peer conversation, and just have a guided conversation around the death penalty and why, kind of where the doubt is coming from. But it's a hard issue for a lot of people. And then in terms of what kind of guidance the various dioceses have provided around the Catechism revision from 2018, I think it varies. It kind of depends on diocese to diocese, whether or not, kind of educating about the death penalty catechism revision has been a priority for the diocese. I do know that there have been a lot of bishops who have been very adamant and public in their support of ending the death penalty. So I think it's a very specific case-by-case basis depending on the diocese. But there's also great resources from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops as well in terms of those educational resources, and Catholic Mobilizing Network too.
And we have time for one last question. Emma, can you give some examples about restorative justice models that are a little more centered on real need of victims and survivors, that are forgiveness and reconciliation centered versus revenge centered.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, understanding the principles of restorative justice boil down to, building right relationship and honoring the human dignity and understanding what the needs of the victims are is kind of the first place to start is, talking to the person who's been harmed about what are their needs? Are they, physical? Are they material? Are they spiritual? And having a conversation centered around their needs versus on what the punishment should be of the person who harmed them. That can look like, it can look very different depending on the case. Sometimes it is appropriate, although not always. There has to be consent from both parties of a victim offender dialogue. If the person who's been harmed feels comfortable and open to the idea of meeting with the person who harmed them, having a guided, facilitated dialogue between the person who was harmed and the person who did the harming in terms of finding some sort of resolution and healing for the person who was harmed.
Very good. Thank you both for your answers to those questions. Emma, I'm going to turn this back over to you. I know we're getting short here on time, and we do want to cover some action steps that we're going to ask everybody to take. If I can just by way of quick introduction say, one of the things that somebody once challenged me with, whenever we have any kind of presentation, any kind of call to action is what's the then what? So this is the now what? This is the now what we would like for you to do.
Yes,
to
okay,
bring
thank
about
you.
the absolution of the abolition of the death penalty.
Yes, okay, let's get into the now what. Thank you, Deacon Paul. So like I mentioned earlier, 2 death penalty abolition bills have been introduced in Ohio's legislative session, 1 in each chamber. We have very passionate primary sponsors in both chambers, hence the dual bills. So the bills are identical. And kind of for context, what will happen is at some point later on in the bill process, the sponsors will have to decide which bill, either the Senate bill or the House bill, will be the vehicle that gets passed and sent to the governor. But we're not there yet. What we're asking people to take action on now is contacting your legislators, your senator and your representative, because they need to know that this effort is what their constituents want. The death penalty is an issue that is, it's time to get it off the books. So once the bills are up for a floor vote, we'll be redoubling efforts to have people contact their key lawmakers, such as lawmakers who are on the fence around the issue, legislators in leadership roles, etc. The timeline of when these bills will be moving through the legislature is not determined quite yet, but what we really need right now is people contacting their legislators to let them know that this is a priority and that you support an end to Ohio's death penalty. So the image you are seeing up on your screen, that is what is up on Catholic Mobilizing Network's website. There's the bit.ly link, and then Deacon Paul is chatting right now the link. So you can just click that, and if you fill out your name and your contact information, and it will ask for your street address and your zip code. That's so the system can populate you with the right legislator. And the letters that will come up, it will be a letter to your senator and a letter to your representative. And for some of you, the letter might say something like, thank you for your leadership on this issue. And that means that the letter is going to one of the bill sponsors of the legislation. And you are welcome and invited to edit these letters as well with any personal reasons for why you oppose the death penalty or why this is a really important issue to you. So please open that link. I was going to set aside a couple of minutes for you to just fill it out right now, but I will let you do that after the webinar concludes here. So that's the Ohio State Action Alert, which is the #1 thing we're inviting you to take action on tonight. And then we also have ready to drop in the chat the petition aimed to President Biden, urging him to take strong action towards ending the federal death penalty, inviting him to work with Congress to commute the death sentences he's able to, and to make sure that no more federal executions go through under his time as president. So that's the Biden petition. And then just lastly, I want to do a plug for the local on-the-ground coalition in Ohio called OTSE. It stands for Ohioans to Stop Executions. They are doing fantastic work on education and advocacy and outreach around ending Ohio's death penalty. I know Kwame is connected with them as well, and so is Deacon Paul, and I am too. So they're fantastic. OTSE.org is their website. And then, of course, we always encourage folks to turn to Witness to Innocence for the stories and just to hear the truth about the death penalty. So I will leave it there for now. And I know we are just a little over time, but we did want to end with a prayer.
And so we bow our heads as we pray. Jesus, you were counted among thieves, and you were the victim of capital punishment. Yet you came to set free those who are imprisoned. Heal the souls of those who, in their pain, inflict suffering on others. Help us to see ourselves in the face of the criminal. Forgive us our sins as we forgive the sins of those who have trespassed against us. Give us the power not to punish, but to heal, not to seek retribution, but to work for restoration and the reign of your peace. Holy Spirit of God, you strengthen us in the struggle for justice. Help us to work tirelessly for the abolition of state-sanctioned death and to renew our society in its very heart so that violence will be no more. Amen.
Amen.
Again, we thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight to learn a little bit more about the death penalty and how we can go about bringing its abolition here in the state of Ohio and on the federal level. I want to very, very much thank both Emma and Kwame for your presentations tonight. Emma, thank you very much for helping organize the event tonight. And Kwame, I've heard your story before, and I'll hear it again in the future, I know, and it will always, always, always touch me and move me. This is something that we can do here now in Ohio and on the federal level. Let's find a way to make it happen. May God bless you all tonight and always. Have a great evening. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Deacon Paul. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
All right, guys.